And we are lucky now to be joined by four individuals who had unique working relationships with Mandela. His biographer, Bill Keller, who is also the New York Times bureau chief in South Africa. Dr. Gay McDougall, a human rights lawyer who campaigned for his release from prison, counseled him during the drafting of the South African Constitution. Stan Greenberg, Mandela's pollster and strategist during his campaign for president. And Ambassador Jendayi Frazer, who served in South Africa under President George W. Bush. Thanks to all of you for being here. And Bill, let me begin with you. We ended that piece on the relationship between President Obama and President Mandela. Of course, they share something very, very important, but they are also very different in important ways as politicians.
They are. It was noteworthy in that earlier segment that the president that Mandela felt closest to was Bill Clinton, because they have more in common than Mandela and Obama. And one of the things that Mandela had was just a joy in the robust give and take of politics, the schmoozing, the deal making, the stagecraft, the theater, absolutely. Whereas Obama is more cerebral and doesn't seem to enjoy going up and shaking hands and doing favors.
And Gay, speaking of the political theater, I think we have the video now. If you were with Mandela on that day he cast that vote for president, waved that ballot, he knew what that meant to his people. It was such a triumphant day. But you were also working with him during all that grunt work of creating a constitution. He knew that that white minority had to be free from fear and had to believe that their rights would be protected.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me say that it's no overstatement to say that I counseled him on the Constitution, but rather I was able to set up a global network of lawyers that did backup research for the negotiators at the table across from the government. But I think it's important to say that Mandela was someone who knew and was always aware of his place in history. And I think that he came out of jail knowing his place in history. He led that nation through a very tumultuous run up to the elections, knowing where he was going and being a very steady hand and voice of reason through what was a very turbulent time in the run up to the elections.
Voice of reason, Stan Greenberg. Of course, you worked with him during his election. But for a man who became known for the power of forgiveness, for reconciliation, as a politician, he also had something of a ruthless streak.
Absolutely. He had clear goals. And one of the things that ran through was this desire to make sure there was a racially inclusive politics. But there were strong strands within the ANC in South Africa, in Africa, that was centered on black consciousness. And he was intent on having an election with a mandate that reduced their role. So he focused on, as you know, the Pan-African Congress, which was polling 2%, 3% of the polls. But historically, they had played a very big role in Africa and in the liberation struggle. And he wanted to use the election to send a message about this was going to be an inclusive country.
And Jendayi Frazer, talking about his relationship with people who he didn't necessarily get along with. We know F.W. de Klerk. They shared a Nobel Peace Prize, even though they didn't share much of a personal relationship. You were served as ambassador under President George W. Bush. We saw in John Carl's piece there. Of course, Nelson Mandela, fierce critic of President Bush on the war in Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. But he was also determined to try and maintain something of a personal relationship there.
Well, actually, President Mandela, just as fierce as he was a critic of the war in Iraq, was as supportive of the war in Afghanistan. If you recall, in 2001, which is when he first met President George W. Bush as president in the Oval Office, he came out of the Oval Office and actually forcefully endorsed America going into Afghanistan. Just as forcibly in 2003, he was against America going into Iraq. But in fact, in 2005, when they met again at the Oval Office, it was to reconcile the issue of how personal the criticism in Iraq had taken. And in fact, to look at where they had mutual interest, for instance, in addressing HIV and AIDS, supporting peace processes in Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Burundi. And so I think that President Mandela actually was able to reach across the aisle as such. He reached across to his political opponents. And so there were many areas where they shared interests and other areas where they diverged. The same was true, frankly, of Bill Clinton. I was at the NSC as director for Bill Clinton, and they did not agree on the Middle East peace process and the role of Hamas and the role of Arafat, and so those issues of the Palestinian order. Mandela was very critical of American policy across administrations on those issues. And so I don't think that political difference necessarily affected personal relationships.
In some ways, Bill Keller, because he was such a practical man, I was struck by a quote you had in your obituary of Nelson Mandela this week, where he was talking about what so many have remarked on, how he was able to appear free of hatred. And he said that hating clouds the mind, it gets in the way of strategy. Leaders cannot afford to hate.
Yeah. Well, that's not an absence of hate on his part. It's a surplus of discipline. He was the most disciplined politician I've ever seen. He knew the difference between strategy and tactics. And there were times when you would see something bordering on loathing in his attitude towards de Klerk and his attitude towards Gotcha Buthelezi, the head of the Kadam Freedom Party. He didn't like those guys very much, but he was able to swallow that, tamp it down, compartmentalize.
And you say he knows the difference between strategy and tactics. Like Abraham Lincoln, he was willing to be very flexible on tactics in order to achieve that goal.
Absolutely. In the course of his life, he was a communist for a while. He was a capitalist. He was a advocate of nonviolence. He was an advocate of armed struggle. He was whatever it took, but he never lost sight of the main goal, which was a South Africa that was run by South Africans.
How does that play out in a candidate running a presidential campaign?
Well, from the beginning, he wanted to learn. He knew he was very disciplined, but he was also disciplined about learning. And so he would listen, he would go, believe it or not, go through poll data, 2 hours presentation, go to a focus group, listen to people. He thought there had to be a popular sensibility. He had an obligation to bring the people with him. He had a very clear goal, but he had an obligation to bring people with him, bring his own people to a certain place, would lecture publicly, he would educate. He was the most educated candidate I ever had who tried to move voters to a new place.
You mentioned the learning, and Gay McDougall, you campaigned for him to release him from prison. He used that time in prison as a place to be educated as well.
Absolutely. I mean, he used it to be educated, and he educated all the other political prisoners who were with them. They often talk about the University of Robben Island, where they spent their time studying political, developments around the world, deciding who they, as a political party and as, activists, wanted to be, what their model of decision-making was to be, so that when they finally emerged from that prison, they knew exactly the road that they wanted to travel.
And in Jendayi Frazer, he was also very conscious of his role as educator when he became president, and then after he left office as well, and didn't often hide his disappointment in what was happening in South Africa and other African nations.
Yes, he certainly was. I think that President Mandela, what I took from him was the courage of his conviction. And so he was very clear when he did not agree, and he would do that both privately as well as publicly. For instance, on the issue of HIV and AIDS, he certainly took to task Thabo Mbeki for not actually responding adequately to that challenge. And so we do see that President Mandela was very clear about where he wanted more action. On the United States, when he met with President Bush in 2005, he took us to task for still having South Africans labeled as terrorists and needing a waiver to get into our country. That was not removed until 2008, basically by an act of Congress and signing into law by President Bush. But clearly he said to us, how can you still, designate ANC senior leadership as terrorists when apartheid was a crime against humanity? And he was very public about that.
It was a life that contained so much. Thank you all very much.